going, everybody? Welcome back to yet another episode of the Liberation Hour. I appreciate everybody for tuning in, staying subscribed, and all the support that everybody has given me really over the last just month and a half that this thing has been getting, on the road. Just obviously, a crazy season with everything going on in the political landscape, but obviously everything going on around the world as well. So appreciate, you guys giving your time to be able to tune in and listen to what I have to say along with my guests on this show. We're back here once again and happy to be accompanied by a couple of guests to talk about some stuff going on around the world. So first off, I'd like to welcome onto the show for the first time, Miss Gabby Armstrong. How are you doing, Gabby?
I'm good. And you?
I'm doing really good. Thank you so much for joining me. Obviously, I know, we've gone to protests together. We've talked about a lot of things, and, I'm glad that you're able to come on and talk about a few things as well. And then I'm also happy to welcome back to the podcast once again, Mr. Dylan Johnston. How are you doing, Dylan?
I'm doing pretty good, man. Thank you for having me.
Of course, yeah. We had a great conversation, of course, last time you were on with Jackson Toft and talked about a lot of things. And I know we have a lot that we're going to get into here today. But, firstly, obviously, a lot of going on around the world right now. But in terms of your guys' lives, how are things going with you guys? Everything good with you in terms of whether it's job, just, things in general? How are you guys doing?
Doing great. If you happen to have a day about cannabis and it's selling in California, you can ask me now. That's the new job.
Awesome. I know that you were, yeah, I saw some stuff on your story of you at the state fair. Of course, it's the first time at the state fair that they've had like a cannabis place for everything and all, which is really cool to see. So that's awesome. Well, congratulations. And Dylan, how about you? How are things going with you? Obviously, we're going to touch on a couple of things with music-wise today when we get into a topic on the show. I know you're in a band, Heavy Petty, out there if anybody wants to give them a listen. But overall, how are things going with you?
Things have been going pretty good with me too. I've been lucky. I've been getting to play a lot of really fun shows lately. Been playing the last few months at least 4 shows a month. So just getting to work a lot, which is really nice.
So I have to ask you, because of the band name in general, and he's an artist that I never got a chance to go see myself. Did you ever get a chance to see Tom Petty live?
I never did. And I remember on his last tour, I think he played, or at least was scheduled to play Golden One. And I thought about going, and I just thought, I'll just see him the next time he comes around. And then, he ended up dying at the end of that tour.
Yeah,
So it's a lesson. And if you want to see one of your heroes, one of your favorite bands, don't wait for later. Go see him. If you have the means, go see him.
yeah, it was very sad, obviously, hearing when he passed away. My parents actually went to that show. He did play at Golden One. And I thought about going. I didn't myself. And obviously now I regret that. But, since then I've seen Paul McCartney because, he's 80 years old now. And, well, he still puts on a kick-ass show. You never know what's going to happen with any artists. And, obviously a band that I love that I never got a chance to see myself was Linkin Park. RIP to Chester Bennington. That was obviously I'd say my generation's Kurt Cobain. It felt like in many ways. So that hurt. But anybody out there, basically what we're saying is, well, it can be expensive, as we'll get into today, and the reasons why that is. If you have a chance to, you only live once. Get out there and see a show or two, even if it's a smaller artist. Support live music for sure. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into the show. We're going to actually talk about an issue related to that a little bit later. But right now, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with the election and mainly a couple of issues that some of the candidates have been bringing up. And one of them that both candidates, Kamala Harris on the Democratic side and Donald Trump on the Republican side, have talked about is the idea of no taxes on tips. So I'm going to go ahead and get into this here as I pull up my screen. Let me go ahead and get this pulled up here for you guys. So this is an article from The Guardian. Harris, no tax on tips. Fires up Nevada hospitality workers, quote, "I want that." We'll go ahead and read this here. Christine serves gamblers playing countertop video poker screens in the center bar of Las Vegas's Ellis Island Casino. She declines to share her last name, but is not timid about her support for Donald Trump when asked about his campaign promise to end federal taxation on tips. Quote, "I want that," Christine says as she fulfills cocktail waitress's orders. Tip compliance, the tax process for expected earnings from tips, has become a political football in Nevada, where federal lawmakers from both parties piling in to co-sponsor bills or present their vision for how tax exemption for tips should work. I'll go ahead and transition this over to Harris's side of things because she endorsed the policy a couple of weeks later. This is from Vox, and this kind of talks about potential issues that some people may have on the bill. So this is from Vox back, I believe, a couple of weeks ago, yeah, August 13th. In otherwise polarizing and divisive election, there's at least one policy proposal that's emerging as a unifying issue. The bad news is most experts think it's a terrible idea. The proposal in question is to abolish federal taxes on tips. Donald Trump originally floated the idea at a campaign rally in June, and it gained enough traction that, quote, no tax on tips signs started making regular appearances at Trump campaign events and the RNC, and now obviously his opponent Harris has endorsed the idea as well. On the surface, exempting tips from being taxed might sound like a pro-worker proposal with populist appeal, potentially boosting take-home pay for service sector workers who rely on tips to make a living, but the policy doesn't really hold up under any scrutiny. And that's because at best, quote, no tax on tips looks a lot less than a tax cut for low and middle income families and a lot more like a subsidy for big business. I'm not at all saying that workers won't get anything, said Heidi Sherholz, president of the Economic Policy Institute, but I think that a meaningful share of the federal expenditures on a tax exemption like this will go to the employers of tipped workers. So this is a really interesting issue because I work at a service job and I've worked there for nearly 8 years now. And I know that obviously, service sector jobs are really some of them. I think young people work those jobs more than maybe any other. Gen Z, it's a job that a lot of people work, whether it's being a server, some tax position, bartender. And I think that a lot of workers on face value would like this idea. But as they kind of mentioned in that article there, one of the potential issues that's been brought up is it going to really influence businesses, whether they're, smaller businesses or larger companies, to kind of force the burden of paying workers back onto the customer even more now with that being the case? I want to get your guys' thought on this. Gabby, I'll go ahead and bring you in. What's your take on the idea? And overall, what do you think are some of the positives and negatives of it?
So I recently picked up a second job due to the economy. Um, but that is also not necessarily tip-based job because California does pay pretty well. But, the best thing about money tips is that you can kind of sneak them past taxes. So whenever I try to tip people, I try to give them cash. But I do agree with the article regarding like this is going to be something that employers kind of utilize to say, see, we don't need to pay them as much because this, that, or the other. And you kind of already see that in a lot of other states when their minimum wage is like $3, $2.50. I have a friend that was working in Indiana. I think he was making like $6 an hour. And I'm like, how do you live? He's like, well, I'm a college student, so I don't have to worry about it. I'm like, well, how do your coworkers live at that point? Because, what's the point of, no taxes on tips? Kamala is saying, well, we're going to raise the minimum wage. And I full-heartedly do not believe her because I'm pretty sure Biden said the same thing. However, I noticed that Trump is not toting that line. And I think it's kind of showing, and it's showing that, it's kind of, let me try to find the words, not for the people. Because at this point in time, we know that a lot of politicians don't necessarily follow what their constituents are asking for. So, I mean, it's business, business, business. It's how do we get these businesses more money? How do we get these businesses? Because it's always the economy, but the economy isn't necessarily business. The economy is us as consumers. So as much as I want to support no taxes on tips, it makes doing tax season a little harder because the taxes are put onto your W-10 or W-2 when you're, if you're in a service industry and you're getting digital tips, those automatically are put into your paycheck, So it makes that a little difficult. It makes auditing a little more difficult. Majority of the time when audits are done, they're not for big people, they're for the smaller person. And so that puts a little bit more of a burden, not only on the IRS, but on us as Americans. So, like I said, it's like I want to support it, but I know that it's not actually for us, and I know that it's not necessarily going to be a good thing.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting perspective for sure. I think you will see that, I think, with a lot of people that work in more, not necessarily just red states. There's also a few blue states as well that don't necessarily have the best wages. But like you mentioned in Indiana, ironically, I'll pull this map up here in a moment. But their minimum wage is what the federal minimum wage is of 7.25. But as you mentioned, the tip wage is different than the federal minimum wage, and in some states it's as low as $2.13. And I think that a lot of workers in those states, obviously, would appreciate not having that taken away. But at the same time, who is it really benefiting more? I think is the big question here. Dylan, I want to bring you in on this. Just what's your thought on that? What do you feel are some of the positives and negatives, and overall, like if there were not necessarily loopholes are what I'm looking for, but if there were ways that businesses could obviously get around this, which is, just basically putting the burden back onto the consumers who are, contributing to these businesses and getting served by these people, what do you feel are some policies that can be enacted to maybe prevent that from happening?
Well, if just as an idea, the idea of no taxes for tips sounds pretty nice, something that would make sense. And of course, the idea and the practical application don't always line up the way they're supposed to. So we would definitely need to see specifics as to how they would plan to address issues like the ones that Gabby just brought up. I do think it would definitely be used by companies to, as you said, put the burden of paying their employees on the customer as opposed to them, particularly in those states where they have a different minimum wage for tipped workers. So there, in order for it to have the effects we would want it to have, we'd have to just get rid of that tipped worker minimum wage. It would just have to be straight up minimum wage. And then as far as policy, I don't know specifically anything other than just having as much transparency as possible. Um, the other thing I'm not totally sure about, and it definitely makes more of a difference now with digital tips being more popular, but I personally have never met anybody who claims they're cash tips. Like, and as a musician, I know a lot of people who get tipped, a lot of people. I've never once seen a musician or a service worker when I worked in food service or any of that. I've never seen anyone claim their cash tips. So I'm not sure how much practical application there would even be from that. Although digital tipping has gotten pretty popular, especially with a lot of bands now. They'll have like a QR code that takes you to their Venmo and you can tip them through that. So, and I honestly have no idea how that works. I've always just done the cash tips. I'm a bit old school, but it would definitely have to be something where, again, those states that have the lower minimum wage for tipped workers, that would need to be gotten rid of, or else I think those states would just use it as a further excuse to pay their employees dirt.
I
Yeah,
think
I think that's a fair point. Go ahead, Gabby. Sorry.
I think for states that already have like the tipped wage, I think you would end up seeing a lot of companies kind of popping up more over there. I mean, I know that tipped tipped stores and stuff like that are a little different than, Amazon and stuff like that, but you know, it's where it's cheaper is where the labor will always go. Um, and I think you'll end up seeing more hospitality pop up in places that aren't necessarily hospitality states for the sake of, oh, well, we can pay our people less if you don't get rid of that tipped wage ability for the states.
Yeah, and I just think that in general, it's interesting how much just of a tip-heavy economy that we are here in the United States, because there's many countries across the world that we're tipping like. Not that it's not allowed per se, but it's almost like discouraged by society. Like, for example, in Japan. Now, of course, in Japan, they have their own economic problems. And I know things that, well, they're cheaper for American people that are going over there to, or tourists that are going over there. They also try to discourage that because at the same time, a lot of the people that are actually working in Japan don't necessarily get paid a great wage, and it's hard for them to kind of make it over there as it is. At the same time, another thing that I think it's important to be brought up about this issue right now is and Gabby, me and you talked about this before the podcast started, is what was the state where this really started getting a lot of momentum for both candidates? And that's in Nevada. And I want to go ahead and share my screen again. And apologies if the connection gets bad on this one website here. I noticed it right when I brought it up, but I at least need to show people. These are the current poll numbers in Nevada right now. And this is ever since July 30th. So we have Harris up 2, Trump up 1, tied. Trump up 3, Harris up 5, Trump up 3, Trump up 1. So we're talking about a state that it's a battleground state. And while there's, obviously battleground states that have more electoral votes, I think Nevada only has 6. Well, there's obviously, states that have more electoral votes that are going to be huge, such as Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina. Nevada is a state where, it's on the west, near the West Coast. So if it's a close race toward the end of the night, it's going to be a state that is probably going to come down to potentially. So I think both candidates are kind of trying to in a way, I don't want to say take advantage of voters, but are obviously trying to get votes out of this issue as well. And in the case for the Republicans, and you mentioned Trump, obviously, as you mentioned, he has not ever mentioned anything about the minimum wage. He doesn't care about that. Democrats at least will try to put the rhetoric out there that they care about raising the minimum wage. And to be fair, in some states they do, but we haven't seen a federal minimum wage increase since I want to say the 90s or the 2000s. Probably, I think, is actually the last time we had it. So it's been near 20 years since we've had a minimum wage increase nationwide, and it doesn't get done by either party. Another thing I wanted to bring up, speaking of the minimum wage, is just looking at this map here of minimum wage state by state. So you could see, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of blue states like California obviously have higher minimum wages, and tipped wages and minimum wage is the exact same wage here. And it's the same thing, if you're a tipped worker in Nevada or a tipped worker in Oregon, tipped worker in Washington, same thing goes for a lot of these different states. But then you get to some of these other states here, like Wisconsin, for example, and Pennsylvania. These two states here are also swing states. So mentioning the no taxes on tips, this is another one right here, because as you can see, minimum wage and tipped wage, way different. Wisconsin, minimum wage and tip wage, way different. So it really feels like it's an issue that is mainly targeted at impacting voters in swing states to try to win the election for a specific party. The actual solution to this issue, and I think we all know this, is just increase the federal minimum wage across the board and increase it in all these states to where people can actually make a living and actually be able to live their life with basic needs. And now, obviously, it's a tough one to answer, because I think a lot of people on the other side will bring up, well, how do you define basic needs? And I think that that's something that is a good conversation to be had. But one thing that's for sure right now, as we've seen with greedflation, as we'll get into here in a moment, while wages stagnate, and we've seen this now for 25, 30 years in this country, it's not working. They're going completely different directions to where it's much more of a burden to just live for young people, millennials, Gen Z, than it is for any other generation in history. And you can see here, too, another issue I wanted to bring up regarding why we need to have strong minimum wage laws in this country. These 5 states down here in the South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Tennessee, well, they have a minimum wage of $7.25 because it's the federal minimum wage. This right here means no specified minimum wage. That means if we did not have federal minimum wage laws, they wouldn't even have a minimum wage on the books. So businesses could pay people dirt. So again, if Harris, especially if she is trying to run a campaign that is more progressive and wants to actually care about working voters, she should be pushing the rhetoric to actually raise the minimum wage and be different from Trump to where she could actually gain voters in that respect. But that's not going to happen. And unfortunately, I think it's just a lot of parroting what sounds like left-wing or populist policies, but at the end of the day is only going to do what always seems to be the case in this country, and that's actually propping up corporations.
I would like to add with kind of a little bit of that, just barely related to it. Um, my household is unfortunately a Fox News household, and it's really funny. I thought you were gonna say something different, which is the opposite of what Fox was saying, is that um, whenever Democrats get close to an election, they get more conservative. And then once they get into office, they go completely the other way to a far left, progressive, woke, whatever, and if you live in reality, you notice that it's quite literally the opposite. You have Kamala, you have Joe, you have Obama toting these progressive, hyper leftist sometimes policies, but once you get into office, where's the relief for student debt? Where's the relief for medical debt? Nobody has said universal health care before, but like, where's universal health care? Where is all the promises that you make on the road? Like, where is, easing up on this or that? But then once you get into office, it's, yeah, we love big pharma, we love big oil, we love a strong border, we love deporting every and anyone. Like, what? I know they're purposefully throwing lies out there because they know that a lot of people don't look at both sides. And that's the unfortunate thing is, people aren't often looking at both sides. I'm kind of forced to look at both sides because I'm, on the left, but my mom is slowly getting further and further right as she listens to this rhetoric. And it's like, you bring something up to somebody like that, and if you even push just a little bit, like, are you sure about that? You're met with like stonewall of just, you know, oh, this, and that. And it's literally just regurgitated Fox News. And you kind of push a little bit of logic in there, or you question them, why are you getting upset about that? I'm saying this, or that, which was an actual conversation I had with my mom. And you get, I don't know. I don't know why I'm angry about that.
Well, and a
And
lot
then
of
you go on
time
to the next thing.
and a lot of time it seems like a lot of the problems that people have economically in this country, a lot more people on um, uh, the Fox News side of things want to kind of turn it more to immigrants or turn it more to specific classes of people instead of turning it to where the actual people are, and that's the bosses and the billionaires. But I wanted to say real quick, just in regards to what you're saying, because I think I brought it up when Dylan was on the show last time. I would be willing to bet the car that I don't have right now that that was probably Jesse Waters was one of the guys saying that, because he is one of the dumbest people on all of television. I
They
will say that
all say the
every
same
show. Oh, I
thing.
know. I know that Jesse Waters is one of the biggest guys in that program, and I swear every time that dude opens his mouth, he just says something that is so antithetical to reality. It's unbelievable. But no, I think what you said is 100% fair there. Dylan, I'll go ahead and give you a chance to respond as well to anything you just heard.
Well, real quick, going back to just what we were initially talking about with the no tips on taxes, I think that's a step that would have to be taken after other steps. And the first step that would have to be taken is, as you were saying, is increasing minimum wage across the board, because otherwise it won't have the effect that the people that are a fan of the idea actually want it to have, which is, you know, kind of easing some financial burden, you know, more money in your pocket. So that's kind of the big thing. And of course, it makes perfect sense that once you pulled up the map with the how the swing states, a lot of them have those different wages. That kind of made everything click as to why this is all of a sudden being brought up now, which is kind of sad because it seems like both sides are intentionally mislead trying to mislead voters into voting on an issue that doesn't have the impact that they're claiming it's going to have. So that's just kind of sad to see across the board.
Yeah. And
Trying to
I was,
say, go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say, yeah, I think that, like you said, that there's a lot of steps on this issue that need to be taken before you even consider that to be, something that, gets moved forward, in terms of, actually trying to, eliminate taxes on, tipped wages. But what I wanted to say, because I know, this is obviously an issue we could, go on and talk about for a while, but I wanted to tie this in, to how this actually reflects Harris's, larger economic plan, because she, also had a couple other ideas that have been brought up over the past week, and, one of which is, attacking price gouging. And I wanted to bring this up here. This is from Forbes. Price gouging, can broadly be defined as when sellers charge more for a product than the fair market dictates based on supply and demand in order to make a higher profit, typically taking advantage of an adverse situation. Think ballpark vendors charging twice the normal game day price for a bottle of water when it's 100 degrees outside. The Harris campaign said Friday that it plans to ban price gouging to combat, quote, the excessive prices unrelated to the cost of doing business that Americans have seen in the food and grocery industry, as well as crack down on mergers, and acquisitions in the food industry to keep competition robust. This comes at a time where, I want to say it's Kronig was trying to, partner with another, large company and basically have more of a monopoly on, the grocery, industry. Also wanted to bring this up. 27%. That is how much more expensive groceries were last month than they were in July of 2019, according to the Consumer Price Index's food at home subcategory, which equates to 5.4% annualized grocery inflation over the past 5 years, a reflection of the continued strain on Americans to put food on their tables. This is another thing right here. I think that, however she may go about, trying to target, price gouging, I think is a good idea. The problem, I think, becomes then at that point, how do you go about doing that? Because at the end of the day, you're going to have a lot of big money interests that are obviously in the party that are going to push back against that. And the question becomes, how is that done? To semi answer that, and then I'll kind of turn the question back onto you guys. I also wanted to bring up this article, and I'll go ahead and share my screen for this one. This one is from, Axios. Sorry, as my computer loads here. There we go. How price gouging bans, really work. Harris, has not provided much detail, as I mentioned, which has led to wide speculation about what this plan could mean. Basically, there are many states that have laws in place. I think the answer is, yeah, 38 states, including Texas, California, New York, prohibiting companies from jacking up prices during emergencies, for example, such as bans on selling, water at a much higher price after a major hurricane. I think, one thing that people might be able to relate this back to a little bit was Hurricane Katrina. There were, times where they were trying to raise prices on certain goods in New Orleans, and you saw a lot of people looting stores, and of course you saw a lot of people pushing back against the people who were looting. Obviously, that got covered, I think, a lot more than the price raises at the time in 2005. Talking a little bit about how this works. So the laws are obviously triggered by an event, usually a natural disaster like a hurricane, pandemic, or even a strike. You did see actually with Biden that, when he did do, at least a version of Build Back Better with the Inflation Reduction Act, that he did, make some policies that kind of related to this, but they were a little bit weaker than, what has been brought up with specific price gouging, bans. Once these are triggered, some laws explicitly prohibit price hikes above a certain threshold, anywhere from 10 to 25%. Others are more subjective, banning egregious or unconscionable price increases. And that's another thing I wanted to bring up about this that is a concern of mine is, since there's no definition of what the threshold can be when it comes to price gouging, even if you make these laws or policies, it doesn't necessarily mean anything will necessarily materially improve a giant amount, because you can set the threshold to whatever amount you want, and it's better than what the alternative would be, but it still would be a very small incremental benefit. Now, I will give Harris credit in the respect that at least bringing up a policy like this shows that she is, different than some of the Democrats that have come before her, and that she is potentially trying to change up the party platform from what we've seen Democrats run on in the past. But I do think that there are still some concerns out there, and I think that, especially in a policy that can be co-opted, not co-opted, but challenged and easily battled by the right, calling it socialism, communism, and whatnot, which it's not. I think you have to be very specific in the way that you would actually explain how you would interpret or implement a policy like this in the public sphere.
I think the term you've been looking for is dynamic pricing. Um, but I definitely think that there are quite a few steps to get out of the way. I know that the Biden presidency did work on the junk fees. Um, I'll be honest, I don't super remember how that went. But I know that that was definitely one of the big things that they were talking about the past year and a half about. Um, so it could genuinely be something that the Harris campaign's able to do. Um, how they'll go about it, I'm honestly not super sure. The price gouging, you can call it price gouging. They're going to change the name to dynamic pricing. You take down dynamic pricing, the corporations are going to name it something else. It's a designer drug of greed, you know? Just switch a little here and there and, oh, I skirted by the law. So
Yeah, Dylan, what's your thought on Harris at least trying to implement this policy, and what do you feel are some challenges that may come with it?
Well, this is a good example of one of my favorite qualities about Harris is that she's trying to push more leftist ideas into the public consciousness. Because if we think about the Republican Party before Donald Trump went down the escalator. Think about Mitt Romney and John McCain. The policies they championed are way different than the type of stuff Trump championed, and he dragged his party over to the far right. And I think the Democrats have done a bad job of trying to move things further to the left. I think they've been taking the approach of trying to move to the center just out of fear of more people leaning towards that far right. But I like that Kamala is at least trying to, with the rhetoric, get the rhetoric at least brought back to the left. Because then once people start thinking about it, if you see more public support, you're more likely to get those kinds of things done. I don't particularly like that the term they're using is price gouging because I don't believe it's the correct term for what it is we actually want to be attacking. Because, like you said, like the majority of states already have price gouging laws. I think what we're really wanting to attack is it seems like a lot of companies will raise their prices for the pure purpose of increasing profit and then use inflation as a scapegoat. Like they pretend that inflation is why they were raising profits, but they're really using it as an excuse. Because if you look at the grocery stores, for example, that you mentioned that average grocery cost was 27% higher than July 2019. So if you look at the major grocery stores, if their profits have increased at all since 2019, then that means inflation had absolutely nothing to do with the prices going up. Like that's just basic math. Um, and that's a trick that big business in general likes to use. They like to confuse people and make them think that correlation is causation, where it is not. So that's really, I think, what at least that's what I hope Kamala is talking about. But I don't think the rhetoric is the terminology isn't really correct in the same way that like I don't like how people use the term critical race theory for a variety of different things. Like so I do worry that there's going to be some intentional misinformation just based off of the terminology. But in
Yeah,
terms of
I
just
think
even bringing the conversation, that's definitely progress.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that the language is something that the right could easily attack on that front for sure.
Oh yeah.
I did want to mention a couple things just because you talked about how it wasn't really inflation, and really it was greed taken over. And I'm going to get into that here in a second. But I did specifically for a second want to talk a little bit about Walmart, because Walmart's an interesting case, because we talked about minimum wage earlier, where in many different states, they pay their workers absolutely dirt cheap, treat them like crap. And then what ends up happening is, in reality, they get a major cut from the government, because a lot of those workers then have to end up going on food stamps, and those food stamps in
Exactly.
return end up getting spent and paid right back at Walmart. So in reality, it's just a circular flow of money that goes back to the same exact place, and that's been an issue for many years. But you're going to see that, I think, a lot more if you allow for more companies to merge together, and I think you would see that a lot more if you didn't have any policies aimed at actually trying to affect the raising prices that we have seen. So like you said, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, but it's just a matter of A, how do you go about the language, and B, how do you go about the implementation of it? I did specifically want to talk a little bit about greedflation. And in reality, I wanted to talk about it a little bit more across the globe, and then I'll bring it back to the United States. This is more in the UK. So corporate profiteering significantly boosted global prices, study shows. This is from The Guardian back in December. Profiteering has played a significant role in boosting inflation during 2022, according to a report that calls for a global corporation tax to curb excess profits. Analysis from the financial accounts of many of the UK's biggest businesses found that profits far outpaced increases in costs, helping to push up inflation last year to levels not seen since the early 1980s. The report from the IPPR and Commonwealth think tanks found that business profits rose by 30% among UK-listed firms, driven by just 11% of firms that made super profits based on their ability to push through stellar price increases, often dubbed greedflation. And there's a few corporations they bring up that show how much profits increased during that time. The top five: ExxonMobil profits of 15 billion increased to 53 billion. Shell 16 billion up to 44 billion. Kraft Heinz 265 million up to 1.8 billion. And then a couple other companies: Glencore up from 1.9 billion to 14.8 billion. These are all pounds, by the way. And then Archer Daniels Midland 1.4 billion up to 3.16 billion. So that just gives you an example of how much some of these companies just got richer during the pandemic and since then as well, because obviously the pandemic was used to justify a lot of things in that respect too when it comes to prices. I want to bring up this article from Jacobin. This was back in June. Food retailers are still lying about inflation and profits. Americans paid roughly 25% more on groceries and dining out this March than they paid in January 2020. That kind of goes along with that 27% figure I gave just a few moments ago, outpacing the rate of general inflation. Over that same period, the companies behind the country's 10 largest grocery and restaurant brands have together returned or pledged to return more than $77 billion to shareholders. And then this right here kind of talks about just seeing how much more consumers spent on, important goods such as cartons of eggs, milk, ground beef. Right here, this kind of shows eggs, ground beef, and milk in a chart, just showing how much it increased from 2019 now up to March 2024. You can see that ground beef for a pound went up over $1. You can see that milk went up about $1 and then since kind of came back down a little bit. And then eggs just absolutely spiked right here, especially in 2023, before stabilizing but still pretty much doubling in price. So you can see just the impacts that greedflation had, trying to claim that, oh, we don't have, the supply, or, oh, people are willing to spend this amount of money, but in reality, they were just driving up prices to really, take care of their shareholders. And so I think that, again, having some policies that are trying to tackle that issue are important. So I think, like I said, and I think you alluded to it too, Dylan, it's a step in the right direction, but it's a matter of where do we go from here, and how hard will she actually tackle on that front. I do think, and I don't want to get too far off track here, but I do think her choosing Tim Walz for VP kind of signaled that she is willing to maybe go out there and, listen to progressives a bit more and co-opt some of those policies. So I think that there is reason for some Americans to be hopeful, but it also is understanding why a lot of Americans too are dissuaded with the Democratic Party after seeing, over a decade of very little change on many fronts when it comes to economic policies.
Her choice in Tim Waltz kind of gave me the same feeling of, okay, she's serious about, at the very least, considering some much more progressive policies and putting those policies into the public consciousness.
I
Yeah.
think the whole bringing it into the public consciousness, whether or not she goes forward with actually bringing change to like what she's saying, I think just having it out there and continuing the paper trail of, well, Democrats were promising us like all of these wonderful, fantastic things that would bring like ease into the American life, bring back the American dream, but they never gave it to us. I think having that continuous paper trail when Americans are so like Americans are paying attention to what people are saying and what people are doing so much more now than previously, as far as I know. And I think if she doesn't go through on these promises of minimum wage, of price gouging, of, whatever else she brings up in the future, if she doesn't provide, the Democratic Party is, if she gets the presidency, the Democratic Party is already a bit of a laughingstock, but they're going to be absolutely trashed at that point because they're going to be the party of broken promises, and
And
I
we've
think
seen
that's generally beneficial when it comes to at least my position of like attempting to vote third party and wanting to get a third party in there. It's better that these bigger parties, these two major parties of the US, like screw themselves over, because that allows a third party to sneak in there.
Yeah, and we've seen just throughout the last 30 years of history, Democrats have the presidency for 8 years, and it goes right back to the Republicans because people don't feel that their interests are being listened to. And it goes right back the other direction, and they just ping pong back and forth. And obviously, Biden was president for 4 years. If Harris does get elected, there's still a question about that. And I'll have a podcast next week talking about my thoughts on the Electoral College after the DNC before we get into the debates. That'll be 8 years at that point, and it's a matter of, does she deliver on those policies? I think if she does deliver on those policies, we're talking about, she could win in a landslide in 2028. But at the same time, if she fails on those policies, as you mentioned, Democrat Party is going to be seen as a complete failure. And if they don't reform, you're going to see, I think, a giant red wave for a while, I think, if the Democrats fail. Oh, yeah, I just realized the internet was failing. Okay, I think we're back. Can you guys hear me now? Yep. Okay, cool. So basically, the last thing I was saying.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Basically, the last thing I was saying, if anybody had that cut off, is that if the Democrats do not pull through on those policies, I think we're going to see a red wave for the next maybe 8 years afterward. So we'll see what happens.
Well, the other thing I want to point out too is it isn't completely on Kamala to just get these things done, because as the president, you don't have the power to create laws. So in order for the stuff that she wants to happen, it's not enough for her to win the presidency. The Democratic Party would have to win both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So if the Democratic Party doesn't take Congress, then it's not a matter of Kamala not delivering on promises. It's a matter of the government just refusing to do the things that she wants to do, because the way it's supposed to work is the executive branch, the president in this case, proposes certain ideas as to what would be a good idea for the country to do. Then it's actually on Congress to actually create these laws and vote on them. So the president can only do so much. And I think that's part of why we have so much flip-flopping from party to party, because I think the average person doesn't realize that, and they just think everything falls on the president. But there haven't been many times that I can recall where one party has just held everything, had a majority of Supreme Court justices lean in their favor, have both houses of Congress, had the executive branch. I think Trump had both the House and the Senate at one point, but I can't recall any other time, at least since I've been paying attention to politics. I wasn't paying attention when Bush was president. I was a child. So,
I will say Obama in his first 2 years. So I think would be 20 to early '09 to early 11, because there's the midterm election, of course.
yeah,
Those 2 years, he had a super majority. And I think this is one of the main things where I think a lot of Democrats get a lot of flack for is that they end up getting Obamacare, when in reality they could have had a much more left-wing healthcare policy, whether it was single payer, whether it was a public option. He had a supermajority in Congress, and they still got through what was essentially a right-wing think tank version proposal of healthcare. So, while there's definitely aspects out there of presidents not having majorities, you see with Republicans when they do have majorities, they're able to enact a lot of their policies out there that are actually damage the American people. But on the other side of the aisle, unfortunately, you see that at least we've seen in recent history that there certainly are some good things like Dodd-Frank and some things out there that can get passed by left-wing administrations, but they also can fall short a little bit as well. Of course, Harris is a different candidate, and we'll see what happens. But I think some Americans may see that history and be a little bit skeptical. So, it's going to be a matter of how hard she wants to hit on that front. But I'll tell you what, Walz has been doing a good job for her in that respect in terms of at least pushing those policies out there. I do have to move
absolutely.
on here because I know we've been talking about that. There is one other economic thing I want to get into, and then we'll get into the next issue regarding Harris. She also has targeted some housing incentives as well. And this is another thing that is impacting a lot of young people in this country, as we've seen house prices skyrocket in the last decade. Harris proposes to provide $25,000 of down payment assistance to first-time homebuyers who have paid rent on time for 2 years, with more generous support for qualifying first-generation homeowners. The proposal stems from an idea that Biden-Harris administration presented earlier this year, which called on Congress to implement $25,000 in down payment assistance exclusively for 400,000 first-generation buyers or first-time buyers whose parents weren't homeowners, and a $10,000 tax credit for first-time buyers. The only thing I'll say on this front is I think it's a good idea. You're going to have people, and they bring it up all the time, but I think that there's a lot of American people that unfortunately don't pay as much attention to politics, and you are going to have to answer for this, is the question of how do you pay for it? Because I think that, there's always people that bring up the idea of, raising taxes on, rather having a higher corporate tax rate, whether it's raising taxes on raising the estate tax. But I think that that's the one thing, is that you just need to be more upfront and specific at how they plan on paying for that. But I think in general, the policy itself is something that would absolutely help a ton of people in this country, as the average home price here in California has skyrocketed to near $500,000 and has skyrocketed in many other states in this country as well.
My computer's about to die, so I'm gonna switch to my phone real quick if
Okay,
Dylan
cool.
wants to take
Sounds good.
over.
Yeah, Dylan, go ahead. I'll let you go ahead and start on this one. What's your thought on this specific policy of Harris, and how you feel it might be able to help some people in the working class that are younger in this country?
Well, this is one area that I really do not know much about. So, give me run the basics by me one more time. It was if you've been paying rent on time for at least 2 years, you get, is it up to a
20
$100,000 in assistance?
$25,000, and it'd be $25,000 specifically going towards first generation home buyers to help them, pay for getting at least a start for their home for their mortgage.
Well, I mean, yeah, that would help a lot of people because I'm trying to remember, depending on where you're buying a house from, you might, if you're lucky, be able to just put 5% down. Um, it's better if you can, at least from what I've heard, you want to try to put 20% down if you can, or 10 at the very least. But in somewhere like California, if a home is a $500,000, if that's the average price of a home, then that $25,000 is 5%. So at least it will get people started on the path towards home ownership. So in terms of just, is it an idea that would help people? Absolutely, because even in the most expensive states like California, it is going to have a tangible enough impact that it will allow people to put down payments on homes that wouldn't have been able to otherwise. As far as the like budgeting implications, how it would be paid for, honestly, I have no clue. I would need to see proposals as to how it's planned to be paid for. If it's something like taking it out of taxes, then great. I'd much rather my taxes go towards people buying homes and sending weapons for genocide and stuff like that, or feeding the military industrial complex or stuff like that. So if it's a matter of taxes, then I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So I'd like to see more specifics.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely want to see some more specifics on this front as well. Gabby, what's your thought on the policy, and how realistic do you think that something like this could be implemented?
I think that it there's a lot of factors when it comes to the United States that makes me say this is unrealistic, when in reality it should be very viable of an option. You look at a lot of, I had 2 years of experience in the mortgage industry, and you see a lot of these houses, and you're eligible if you're purchasing land in the country and you plan on utilizing it for farming of any sort, and there is a specific minimum of acreage used for agriculture or amount of animals on the property, but you're able to get USDA assistance for these like properties, and it's a hefty chunk, a decent amount of time. And so when you look at that and you know that that's already happening, then $25,000 sounds like no big deal. However, $25,000 to the layman sounds like a decent amount, especially if you're in a state where you're not seeing the median price range be between 300,000 and 700,000 for a starter home. And so I think that the House and Senate are probably, and especially the reactionary like media, is going to say, where's this money going to come from? We have no money, we're in debt. Like all of a sudden, like they're going to be addressing the debt that we have, the deficit we have, when they never mention that in any other port. I mean, they do mention it, but exaggerating, you know? Obviously, you can pull it from the military budget. Uh, you can always pull from the military budget. I mean, what's the statistic? If you add up the top, other than the United States, if you add up the top 3 or 5 nations' military budgets
It
combined,
might be
like
10.
that still doesn't even like add up to what we spend. And like the reactionary part of me wants to say, just don't baby Israel anymore, and you have plenty of money for really anything you want. But that's obviously not going to happen. So most likely where we're going to see cuts, if we do see cuts at all to be put forward on this, unfortunately, is probably going to be other welfare items. You know, we're going to see fallbacks on SNAP. We're going to see fallbacks on like education, like affordable housing. Like we're going to get less affordable housing built by regulation and stuff like that, other than in, you know, California, where we generally try to like proliferate when it comes to Section 8 housing. Um, and as much as I would love an extra $25,000 for a starter home, like in the America we live in right now, it's not necessarily a feasible like thing that can happen. We're probably not going to see the media talking about USDA loans. We're not going to see the media talk about the fact that there's already first-time home buyer, grants provided to a lot of people, and a lot of people simply don't know about these options. You see a lot of times when I was looking through these documents, like, I didn't know. None of my coworkers knew when I brought it up to other people in my family. Like, maybe a third of them knew that, first-time homebuyers get, X percentage or X amount of money to purchase these homes. But when you ask the general public, how many of them actually know that these, resources are already there for them? I would love to buy some acreage. I already want to be having some livestock, to be having some, fields of whatnot. And I happen to know about the USDA grants. But how many people that are purchasing land for these same purposes know about these grants?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest issues for sure on this front is just viability, because this isn't, there's a lot of issues that, I've thought of that could be improved when it comes to economic policy in this country. And well, obviously this is a very important issue. And it's one that I was very surprised and kind of hoodwinked that they even brought up, because it's like, wow, you're going that far right now. We have so many other places to go before it feels like we need to get to this place. So it's going to be interesting to see if she does follow through. But this is one of her policies, I think, that is kind of jumping over a bridge right now, which it's going to be very hard to get to that point. But by the way, too, just going back to it, and you call me a reactionary for asking how we're going to pay for it? I'm just kidding.